Okay, so we're going to move on to Lewis's science fiction trilogy, specifically Out of the Silent Planet today, as the first installment in the space trilogy, the ransom trilogy, whatever you want to call it. And I'll say a little bit about its background, although we've already at least hinted at that in our first couple of novels that I said were influential in the genre, and I'm more interested in it as a response to a genre of writing with atheistic premises, with consequences that spill over not just in the area of theology as a discrete discipline, which is banished from modern universities come the 19th century. So the university, I think, of Alexander Humboldt University in Berlin, begun in the early 19th century, had no theology in its faculty. And that's the case in many universities that followed the modern template. Theology was not only no longer the queen of the sciences, but was no longer considered to be an academic discipline at all. And if you wanted to study theology, then you would have to go to a Bible college. So the Bible college movement emerges in the 19th century and 20th century, such as Tyndale's own origins, largely then as a response of the church to the abolition, not of man, but of God from the university, officially. And I think the malign effects of that are significant, in part because Bible colleges largely just then study theology, but they don't study the whole of the realm of knowledge that we would attribute to the university. So they focused on understanding the biblical text, preaching the word of God faithfully, etc., recovering at that, but not the downstream consequences of a biblical worldview into all disciplines as the queen of the sciences. So the queen then of the seven liberal arts. That vision was dispelled, and the sort of Bible college movement is not a correction of that challenge. It's a good thing, but it's not a sufficient thing. When Lewis writes this series, he begins this, by the way, in 1937, let me say this, having had a conversation with J.R.R. Tolkien. Remember, this course is on the two writers. And both men are lamenting the state of contemporary fiction. And it's a little like Wordsworth and Coleridge deciding that they are going to try a new species of literature. For Wordsworth and Coleridge, it's the lyrical ballads that they penned together, and it begins the Romantic movement in England. At least that's the traditional take on this. In this case, the two men agree that Lewis will write a space travel story, and Tolkien will write a time travel story. Tolkien never writes the time travel story. But that was the initial idea, was that they would come at the problem like from perspective of space and time. Both are incorrectly understood in modern fiction. The spatial problem is one of, I would say, incarnation. The time problem is a problem of eschatology, or if you will, anagogy. Last time I talked about the anagological driving upwards, or the futuristic tendency. They're implicated, but they're not the same. Remember in Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, he talks about categories of understanding in terms of space and time. And both of them are implicated in the subject area that we will call the quadrivium. I talked about that, the sciences of number, of which we have mathematics and music and geometry and astronomy, historically speaking. And time is also connected with that conception as well. And if you want the sort of locus classicus for that, the study of time in Christian thinking, then look at Augustine. I believe it's chapter 11, but I'm not 100% certain. I think it is, of his Confessions, where he talks about time and the problem of time. And by the way, I'm speaking on Genesis in 2 weeks' time at Bayview Glen, along with a number of others. How do we understand the first text of Genesis from a biblical perspective? They want me to speak as a literature professor. How do we read those books of Genesis? But space and time are distorted in part because they are, by the scientists, understood in a certain way. And so for your, in our class webpage, I've cited an essay here from a book by James Owen Weatherall, Void, the Strange Physics of Nothing, which is an expansion on the idea of nothingness in modern physics and the problems that ensue therein. And Lewis is addressing the problems of a sense of absence or vacancy in modern physics as it plays out in our notion of space. Remember, in the fiction of H.G. Wells, his notion of space is outer space, a void, a vacancy, expects emptiness. Now, he gets that idea not from the 20th century, nor even the 19th century. He gets it from the 18th century. Sir Isaac Newton. So here's the quote, rather than read the whole essay to you. Isaac Newton thought of empty space as nothingness extended in all directions, a kind of theater in which physics could unfold. But, and this is the 20th century response to this notion of Isaac Newton, both quantum theory and relativity tell us that Newton's picture can't be right. Nothing, it turns out, is an awful lot like something, with a structure and properties every bit as complex and mysterious as matter. So there's the quote that I yanked out of this, which is just a book review of this book by James Owen Weatherall on the significance of nothing. So nothing is not nothing. It betokens something, and has a structure, and it has a consequence as well that spills over into all of life. And I talked about that last time when I said that Lewis refers to two types of equality, one of which is medicine against our tendency, because of original sin, to tyrannize other people and to dominate them. And we can see that in Lewis's, or Tolkien's rather, the Ring of Power, the One Ring, to rule all of life, that sense of the libido dominandi, the will to power or to dominate. And so we need equality as a sense of medicine against that great poison of power. On the other hand, there is a notion of equality that is going to just clear cut everything that is not the same and reduce it all to a sameness. And my submission to you on this is that the sameness is that of the void, of emptiness, of nothingness. So it has a nihilism embedded in it, baked in. And it's not accidental that the main philosophical development of the 20th century, in addition to existentialism, is nihilism. Very strong in the French writings like Sartre, where he writes about being and nothing. But Lewis, as I say, is writing this work. He writes this in 1937, the one we're looking at today, Out of the Silent Planet. The other ones are written Perelandra in 1943, and I believe that That Hideous Strength comes in 1945. So just in terms of the chronology of the works as they're written. And it's interesting, and I put The Abolition of Man between the second and the third installments because he writes that in 1943 alongside Perelandra, and I think it's helpful to see him considering the consequences for our notion of human nature in thinking about space travel, science fiction, contemporary fiction, etc. And the main character is the same in all three. His name's Elwyn Ransom, probably modeled after J.R.R. Tolkien himself. And I think that's actually pretty clear, and it will be. At first, you might think it's Lewis himself, except that at the end of Out of the Silent Planet, Lewis himself appears as a character, so he's not Ransom. They have a conversation about what has just happened, etc. So he introduces himself at the conclusion, lest we think that Ransom is just Lewis himself going out. I don't think we can come to that conclusion. I've already said that in the last class, when I talked about his transpositional poetics, that Lewis is trying to do a couple of things. One, he is trying to include the anagogical dimension. So he is trying to get us a sense of transcendence. He's trying to give us a sense of transcendence, which is not equal, it should be that, to spirituality, or pure spirit. On the one hand, he wants that. He wants to create a sense of transcendence in his novels that are not equal to and are speaking against the sense of spirituality or pure spirit, which characterizes the human sciences. And Hegel's great work is called The Phenomenology of Spirit, Phänomenologie des Geistes. And the sciences that ensue are called the Geisteswissenschaften. So there is that tendency to spiritualize everything and eliminate everything that isn't transcendent. That's characteristic of the human sciences, one of the trajectories. The other sense that he has, though, at least as significant, is that he wants to include the significance of incarnation to human nature. And that is not the same as materialism. He wants to give us a sense of incarnation and transcendence in his portrait of life, engaging in the genre of science fiction. And you can, when you read Out the Silent Planet, it is very clear in its plot line and even in its characters and even in the inclinations of the character that it's very much patterned after H.G. Wells' work, First Men in the Moon, which we've read. We have a businessman who's interested in gold. We have a scientist novelist with an active imagination that's really interested in the advancement of man. So he's a more admirable character. Lewis includes both of them in his story as well. And so what's really helpful then is to read the two alongside, or this is why we have read them alongside one another, is to compare them and contrast them and to say, well, what's different about them? What does Lewis do in response to H.G. Wells? And let's notice the differences and note the significance of the differences. But with that, I'm submitting to, he's not just responding to H.G. Wells, he's responding to a whole movement of the intellect that is rooted in the Enlightenment. So it's more significant than merely, I'm going to write a novel that is engaging with H.G. Wells. He's engaging with a sort of atheistic materialism, or just atheism. Because I don't want to say materialism, because that's one attribute of it. It can go in either one of two directions. It has no way of uniting the material and the spiritual. So it goes into one or the other. Either way, it's flattening it, it's leveling, it's destroying. It makes man a purely spiritual being, or it makes man a purely material being, and has no way of uniting the two. Whereas a Christian anthropology can unite the two and does unite the two. Because again, in the incarnation, God takes on human flesh. We have the God-man, Jesus Christ. And he has two wills, a divine will and a human will. He doesn't have one will. The Son incarnated has to submit himself to the will of God. It's Garden of Gethsemane. Take this cup from me, he prays. yet not my will, but thine be done. Decides to go to the cross. He doesn't want to go to the cross. As a man, he does not want to go to the cross. But he's willing to submit to the Father's will and does the Father's will, as we see throughout. So there are two wills. You can read it out of Scripture. And that sense of then a God whose image we bear being incarnated in a man is vital to Christian theology, and it's going to hold on to both the spiritual aspect of human nature and the material, and it's not going to do what the ancient philosophers tended to do, which is to deny the significance of the material or to see the body as a prison house for the soul. And so philosophy then is to tend towards, just like Hegelian philosophy does, is to prioritize this and to denigrate this, the significance of this. We got to get rid of the incarnation, the material sense, and move to something higher. And therefore, and we're going to see this portrayed in Lewis's novels, when he encounters the different beings, and the ones that are more rational, it's going to assume are more spiritual, and therefore are the leaders, just like the scientists are in our world. And they're going to have malevolent intentions, just like the scientists in our world, just like Victor Frankenstein did. It's going to be driven by a sense of advancing human cause without any allegiance to human nature. You're going to deny the lives of his crews are of any significance in the face of the grand cause of pushing beyond the boundaries of humanity in the Arctic voyage. Right? That's where Isaac Walton begins his exploration. Victor Frankenstein does something analogous when he creates a human being out of corpses. He goes beyond a limit of human nature. And in the case of Victor, he violates a sacred taboo by digging up bodies and patching them together. And the fact that he can do it is sufficient for him to think he should do it. And the ought question, ought I to do this? Is there something wrong with this? Doesn't enter his imagination until he creates a being that is incarnated, and at which point he's so horrified by what he sees that he runs away from it. He doesn't love what he's created, he hates what he's created, and what he's created is something in his image. So there's a lot of imaging going on and parallels going on. And remember, the ancient Greek story of the birth of Athena comes out of the head of Zeus. And Milton echoes that in Paradise Lost when he talks about the birth of sin from Satan's head. She emerges from his side, and he loves her, and it's a very vulgar association, violates her. So but thereby violates himself. There's this perversion in this, and this creates death. That's Milton's rather imaginative conceptualization of Satan giving birth to sin, and sin gives birth to death. I think it's echoing James 1, verse 17. And Milton's just personifying it, presenting it in that form. But Lewis, when he's engaging with this, is trying to present an alternative to this view. And that's what I think is vital about this, is to see it as, again, not just a fictional response to a work of fiction, but as a Christian response to the problems bequeathed to us by atheist modernity that is centered around a sense of physics as a nullity, as a nothingness, with the view from nowhere being the ideal. So it wants to eradicate every human feature that is not reducible to nothing. And maleness and femaleness will be one of those features. So will rationality, actually. They will try to eliminate rationality as a human distinctive. So in the Wells's science fiction, some of the creatures on the Selenites are seemingly lacking in intellect. There's a Grand Lunar who has spiritualized himself, and then there's basically just really functional machines. That's, again, the atheist mentality it realizes it needs the function, but it can't combine the two, and it sees the progress of everything being that separation of the two. Modern psychology has the same problem when it talks about its discipline. Some are going to see it in terms of pure spirit, and that's the Freudian tendency. And some are going to reduce the psyche to the brain. Very popular in our day, largely because the big pharma can't really make money off of the logotherapy. Can make a lot of money off pushing chemical pills. And of course, they have some effect because we are actually composed of chemicals and have biological properties that can be addressed. And it does affect your thoughts. Just like if you don't eat for a while, you get hangry. There is a mental effect to a physical action, feeding yourself. Likewise, if you don't eat for a while, you'll find great mental clarity through fasting. There's a clarity that comes from that because your body prioritizes the processing of food above all other things. So you feed yourself, that's what's going to. So never eat before an exam, let alone eat in an exam. You don't need it. It doesn't help you. It doesn't give you energy. That was a sort of irrelevant side, by the way, but you don't need as much food as you ingest. And it's not going to help you think. So he is engaging with the First Man on the Moon. By the way, I understand that he was given a copy of this in 1908 as a Christmas present. I think I was given that around the same time, actually. All of H.G. Wells' works, in fact. And I read them around the same time, 9 or 10. When we first read this, he makes dismissing references to Wells's conceptions, but that's Ransom's viewpoint. It's not necessarily Lewis's. Lewis is more complementary. And again, in his little work on science fiction, he says that it's the best of its type. And early editions of the novel have a disclaimer, and here's the quote: "Certain slighting references to earlier stories of this type, which will be found in the following pages, have been put there for purely dramatic purposes." So it's the character's perspective. The author would be sorry if any reader supposed he was too stupid to have enjoyed Mr. H.G. Wells's fantasies or too ungrateful to acknowledge his debt to them. So Lewis admires H.G. Wells and wants to acknowledge a debt, but the character is not representing Lewis then. And another work we could look at, there's several of them. David Lindsay's A Voyage to Arcturus, written in 1920, is a sort of influence. And so is, and I think more influential is Olaf Stapleton's Last and First Men, 1930. And also an essay that he refers to repeatedly, H.B.S. Haldane's Possible Worlds, 1927. Because in those latter two, Stapleton and Haldane, he detects what he calls evolutionism. So I get asked this question all the time. Lewis's view is on evolution. And there's some complexity there. You see, on the one hand, he seems to be mocking of it, critical of it. On the other hand, he's willing to entertain it as a possible scientific theory. So he said, like, where do you actually stand on this? He is wholly opposed to evolutionism. What does he mean by that? Evolution is represented in this story, which is it's a belief, amoral in nature, that humanity can perfect itself, a master race that will spread throughout the universe. Evolutionism is an amoral belief that humanity can perfect from itself a master race by applying scientific techniques. Or if you want to put it in, rather than evolutionism, you could just call it eugenics, because there is a significant overlap in those two terms. And eugenics is a movement that we find throughout the Western world. Yes? He does sometimes as well. Yeah, Wellesianity is the big picture, which he also admires and opposes. He mocks it, but he also recognizes its potency on the popular imagination of his contemporaries. When I say popular imagination, I don't only mean people on the streets But amongst the scientific people, the elites, Wellesianity is their religion, more or less. So it's an odd old thing that we can see a religious vantage in atheist conceptions, but that's what we have. And I guess it's probably what is to be expected if we think that theology is the queen of the sciences, that it governs all things below. If your theology is just atheism, it's still going to govern your view of the other sciences. And instead of God and his triune nature and his incarnate redemption for human nature and his disposition of grace, or his decree of grace to those who believe, you're going to get something replacing it, which is, again, not without its effect. It's the effect of nothing on everything. So when Lewis writes this, the early reviewers recognized, by the way, what I've just said, that Lewis is writing in response to science fiction, and what he is doing is trying to substitute a theology for the atheism. That's early reviewers recognize this. And that he's deploring not only Wellesianity and evolutionism, but scientism. Also, the belief that science can tell us everything about life, including science. Science defines science. And at the same time, and here's the ridiculous thing of it, they appeal to the empirical method to establish the validity of modern science, but the term science itself is not empirically verifiable. So they're chasing their tail. And what they fail to recognize or acknowledge is that they're engaging in philosophical and theological speculation. They just don't want to admit that. And so, but Lewis notes the omission and points out that any amount of theology can now be smuggled into people's minds under the cover of romance without their knowing it. Any amount of theology can be smuggled in. So if that's the case and his contemporaries are smuggling in atheism, why should he, a Christian humanities professor, not smuggle in correct views? Or more, if when I say correct views, more defensible views, more humane views. Views in which human life has meaning and purpose and value. Individual life, I mean, not just the life of the human race. So in the novel, Ransom proposes a very similar approach to Lewis, and it's quoted in the postscript, and I'm not going to read it, and I have an excerpt here, I won't read the whole thing. He said, what we need for the moment is not so much a body of belief as a body of people familiarized with certain ideas. If we could even effect in 1% of our readers a changeover from the conception of space to the conception of heaven, we should have made a beginning. So his aims are modest. For 1% of his readers, or 1% of the population, to move their perspective from the vacancy, the void, the nothingness that is currently the fashionable intellectual position, to an idea that there is actually heaven. He says this is a huge beginning. And what he proposes as substitutes are not just this for that, but actually reversals. So this is what's going to be particularly interesting. So he's not just going to replace transcendence, let's say, with another view of transcendence or spirituality. He's going to have a sense of an anagogy, a heaven, a new heaven and a new earth. So it has a place. Remember at the end of Scripture, Revelation 21, it talks about not annihilation, but a new creation. There are views of amongst the atheists of our day that life is going to end in a total annihilation of everything. Everything's going to be destroyed. Not a scriptural view at all. Everything will be restored, renewed, healed, and there'll be a new heaven and a new earth. And it'll be like the first, but without the vestiges of sin. So he's going to give us a different sense of transcendence, but it's rooted then in eschatology. And the anagogy antagogical method which drives us that way is towards an eschatological vision. So it goes towards eschatology, and the eschatology will be of human nature. Remember, in the new heavens and the new earth, we will have resurrection bodies. Not resurrected spirits, but resurrection bodies. Read 1 Corinthians 15. So it's not just a substitute for that, a Christian spirituality. It's a spirituality that is anagologically driven towards a view of creation as good but corrupted, and it will be restored and healed and renewed, which is why what happens in this life matters in heaven, which is why we're called in the Lord's Prayer to pray that thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We're realizing the eschatological consequences of the resurrection of God in the here and the now. You're bringing about, to some degree, the new heaven and the new earth in earthly terms with eternal consequences. So it's not just a substitute, it is a repudiation, it's a reversal of it. On the other hand, he will also have a different view of what's going to happen. So in Malacandra, in Out of the Silent Planet, we have the planet Mars, named after the Roman god of war, obviously. And once this was viewed as the influencer of war, of disruption, of chaos. That's what happens when wars take place. Life is destroyed, like Ares in the Greek conception, Mars in the Roman. The god of war is going to destroy, is the destroyer of things. It's going to disrupt everything that's ordered. But in Wells's scenario, in the War of the Worlds, which we're not reading, the Malacandrians, he doesn't call them Malacandrians, the people from the outer space, if you will, come to destroy Earth. That's not how Mars or Malacandra is going to function in this story. Here we will have a different species, 3 different types, the Hirasa, the Sorns, the Fifiltrigi, living in harmony, and from which members of his own corrupted species are expelled as the bringers of violence and exploitation. So the warlike are actually the people from Earth. So he flips it around. We go to Mars in the form of Weston and Divine in order to annihilate the creatures that are there to make space for human beings. Well, so we're the warriors that are going to destroy and create chaos rather than the other way around. So this is not just a different view, it's a contrary view. Those that come from outer space are not the enemy, we're the enemy with our view of life. And what we then get is a reversal to basically a post-medieval Renaissance and its view of the heavens in accordance with that which he describes in The Discarded Image. The field of heaven is peopled by angels. And that's the reason that Lewis contacts Ransom in the first place, because he is a student of medieval literature interested in the allegory of love. He writes the allegory of love in 1936. This novel is written in 1937. So immediately after he writes the allegory of love, he writes this and then includes himself at the end of this story as a medievalist, very interested in tracing this, and he wants to talk to Dr. Ransom. And you'll note in the third iteration of this that that hideous strength, that Jane is a Renaissance PhD student studying love. And there's a lot of discussion of Venus incarnated and so forth, and what's the meaning of love, and she's reflecting on this. She again is I don't want to say represents Lewis, but it represents Lewis's ideas there. She's thinking these things through. She's as yet unconverted at the beginning of the story. She gets converted in the course of the story. So in Lewis's study, by the way, The Allegory of Love, the first work I ever read by Lewis. I didn't read any of the fiction. I read him as a literature professor when I was doing medieval literature. The Platonic school at Chartres in France were presented as pioneers of medieval allegorical poetry. And for them, and here, this is the key line, nature was not opposed to grace, but rather as an instrument of grace in opposing the unnatural. Just like you'll read about in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So nature is not opposed to grace, it's rather an instrument of grace in opposing the unnatural. And what's the unnatural? It's the sinful. That's what is monstrous. Sin is what's monstrous. That's what's unnatural. It's opposed to nature. It's opposed to rationality. It wants to annihilate everything. In the name of advancing humanity, a humanity that is evacuated of all content and is willing to kill everybody to do it, and every being that it meets. So the monstrosity that is spoken of in Frankenstein's novel is actually sinful human nature. And it's not human nature on its own, it's driven by the doctrine of demons, quite literally in Lewis's story. So that's why I want to say at the beginning, and as I say, Lewis is going to push different views of transcendence and different views of immanence in this, and the incarnation Christian theology is vital to both of those. And the effect of this is particularly evident in his portrait of what it means to be a person. Now this is where we're going to connect the incarnation with a sense of transcendence. It's going to be connected to the view of personhood. And this is something that I have been thinking about my entire scholarly career. As a PhD student, my actual doctoral thesis was on the word silence, believe it or not. In English and German Romantic writing, that was what it was focused on. I eventually dropped the German because it became too cumbersome to sing. But I can read German, and the word silence has the same significance in German literature as it does in English. It reflects a certain transcendence. It's a sublime ideal. It's an expression of that. And it has the characteristic of nothingness. It has a divine attribute, as it were. But in the void, the artist's imagination gets projected into that. And so the imagination of the Romantic poets, since God has given the character of vacancy or emptiness and is silent, we fill the void with our imaginative storytelling. And the effect of this has a very consequential outworking on our notion of human nature, which I realized very early on was the most significant feature of modernity. Is it just abolished theology altogether as having any significance in the humanities, but this had a trickle-down effect on our view of human nature as well. And it exploded in the two directions. You become a materialist or you become a pure spiritualist. And what's interesting is that in the behavioral and the social sciences, remember, and so when I wrote this up and published it, it was called Romanticism, Hermeneutics, and the Crisis of the Human Sciences. At the crisis of the human sciences, they didn't know what human was. They're pushing the human sciences, but they had no definition of the human. They had one from the Christian classical world, but their own view of God was nothingness, and so the human being that bears his image is going to be pushed in any direction they want, and there's no template there for correction. We don't have the God-man as the view of human nature, that we are made in the image of God or whatever. And so in the behavioral and social sciences, views of human nature and behavior like to see through things morality, spirituality, and religion are things to be seen through, because they say they're effectively nothingness there. And Lewis makes the comment, if we keep trying to debunk everything, there's nothing left to debunk. And that's what he describes in The Abolition of Man. People appeal to the good, the true, the beautiful, but then the scientists have to debunk the idea that there is such a thing as good or beauty. They're just feelings that we have. So there's the hard scientist, the materialist, telling the humanities scholars that notions of goodness and beauty and truth and justice, etc., are just feelings that we have and therefore are not real. So the hard sciences crush the soft sciences. What do the soft sciences do in response? They adopt the methodology of the hard sciences. And so they will repudiate morality, spirituality, religion. And the end effect of that, and I think the most consequential one, is the one of B.F. Skinner, which attacks C.S. Lewis explicitly as the foremost representative of the literatures of freedom and virtue. Freedom and virtue, both are opponents of modern science and modern scientific determinism. Freedom, the appeal to freedom as having value, is a consequence of the incarnation and of human nature. Sufficient to have stood, though free to fall, says Milton. Such I created all spiritual beings, them that stood and them that fell. For if he had not created them free, they could not have chosen to obey him. And if they hadn't chosen to obey him, he could not have rewarded them for their love. If he'd forced them to do, they only do what they needs must. Then it would just be, they would be automatons and they wouldn't bear the image of God. Freedom is part of God's nature. It's also a part of human nature. Lewis values that because to choose to do something good is to acknowledge morality and goodness, and also to have its opposite effect, to repudiate and have contempt or disgust for what is evil. And so all education is moral education in its nature. But in the modern social science, behavioral science is even more consequential, that term, behavioral science. We treat people like human animals. You can condition them, give them food. You can either use the carrot or the stick, but you're conditioning them as if they're just automatons, like animals. And what you deny in them is the one thing that distinguishes an animal from a human being. There's two things, actually, but it's reason, rationality. The capacity to think and to imagine things being different than they are, which isn't just hypothesizing, it's to think in those realms, which is how we can think in terms of number, by the way, which is an abstraction. It's a non-material thing. You never see or meet a number. It's a representation of a necessary idea. It allows us for the outworkings of the Trinity, which is that we have a sense of God as one God and also many, the one and the many, the problem of the one and the many. This is a big philosophical issue in the ancient world, solved by the Trinity, by the way. God is both ultimately one in nature and ultimately many, and without contradiction. Not enough is said about this, the one and the many. Modern theologians do a little bit engage with this. Did you have a question? Or yes, please. Mal Yes. So, Yes. Mal-Eldil, yeah. It's Aslan. Or the Emperor over the sea, even Aslan is the son, more or less, and the great Emperor over the sea is the father. Not much mentioned in Narnia, but it is there. And then, of course, Aslan breathes, so that the spiritual dimension's there as well. So the Holy Spirit, he breathes on and sings the cosmos into being and breathes on the children, and it has a animating effect, and he breathes the dead statues to life, etc., and so forth. So there's a trinity at work there. Yes, I think you're correct. The reductionism and the pragmatism. Right. Yes. So in modern evolutionary psychology, the idea of image bearing is an evolved concept. It's not something that we had initially. It's not part of our nature. It's something that is the product of a development of humanity. So we develop image bearing as we mature and become more in line with the transcendent view. And the effect of that will be seen in modern bioethics. So Peter Singer, the famous Princeton bioethicist, will argue in favor of not just abortion, but infanticide. Not that he thinks that we should do it, but he thinks it's permissible. I mean, maybe he thinks we should do it. I don't think that that's his position. I think he thinks that it's permissible because we have as yet at that early age to have developed the image-bearing trait, which is true of fully functioning adults. And if you're going to hold that position, then the image bearer is the pinnacle of the mountain, and then everything that falls below that is going to lack that image bearing trait. And well, what you have left? Well, you have the philosopher scientist looking outwards at the top of the mountain, like that picture from Caspar David Friedrich's painting, looking out with a back turned to us. That's the image bearer. And you're right, Lewis talks about this in Narnia. He talks about it really in an advanced way, in the best form, in my view, and I know that you agreed, the time in Till We Have Faces. He's really reflecting on what it means to have a face, to have an image, and how that image comes from relating to God then, and the God of love. The acquaintance with the God of love gives us our own face, because we know that it's not our loves that create God, but rather God's love that creates us, and we respond to that. So the image bearer, but that comes from being a rational being. It doesn't, and when I say a rational being, a being that has the capacity for reasoning, not manifests its full flower. Otherwise, the image bearers would be the scientists and the theology professors or the humanities professors, if you even think that they have reason, which in general they don't, and maybe because they often don't. They appeal to their feelings and not to anything rational. But Lewis, note, is a scholar whose early work is on the allegory of love, and he wants to emphasize the rationality of love, the orderliness, our capacity to see it and understand it. And B.F. Skinner's behavioral determinism in Beyond Freedom and Dignity sees Lewis as his grand opponent. And the idea of human dignity is also being defended by Lewis, because human dignity is not seen in abstraction. The whole race has a dignity, but an individual person has dignity. And you may not treat them in a certain fashion as a consequence. You have to be aware that it's God's creature that you have in front of you. You can't just kill them willy-nilly. That's there in Genesis 6 verse 3, by the way. Before the flood, in response to the ethics of Cain, where he killed his brother. It says that God's created them, you may not shed his blood. That's before the 10 Commandments as well. And it explicitly gives the rationale. Let me see if I can pull this up here just so you see it for yourself. You might not be as have the text in your mind as clearly. Is it Genesis 6:3? It is, right? No. Cain's in book is in 4. I understand that. Or is it 8 or 9 then? It must be 9. I thought it was. It can't be 9. There it is. 9 verse 6. Sorry, my memory fails me. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For, this is why, in the image of God made he man. So there's the explanation. Not because there's an intrinsic worth to the creature, but rather that creature bears the image of God. So when you strike at a man, you are effectively striking at God. On the other hand, there is a consequence for bloodshedding, which is that there shall be a death penalty. That comes later. It's expanded on when you deal with the Decalogue and so forth. But it's right there already. And the explicit connection here in the image of God evokes Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and 27. God created man in his own image, and his image created he them, male and him, male and female created he them. Man as a generic entity. So it goes through Skinner's behavioral determinism and into modern, by the way, more recent evolutionary psychology, which will argue that morality has a biological basis. That's the most fashionable view of our day. There's a biological basis for morality. And as I say, Peter Singer is the most famous exponent of this because he's the most, I would say, the boldest to defend the position. Since this is true, that from his point of view, that biology is the basis of morality, we need not hold on to the idea of the freedom of mankind mattering or the dignity of man mattering on the basis of materialist and utilitarian assumptions. Singer argues that we have no more innate value than any other being. So the appeal to the right to the life is no stronger in human beings than it is in the plant material of the world. It's the source. Evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology is the basis for the radical green, dark green movement that animates the politics of our day and the globalism. Dark green, or watermelon communism if you prefer. Green on the outside, red in the middle. Because the idea that we have dignity depends on a capacity for self-awareness that develops as we age. If you really want to push it, I suspect it will get pushed to the age of 25 because the brain continues to develop until 25. So there, from 25 onward, for a brief period while you have the full capacity for intellectual pursuit, you can't take that person's life. But then the cognitive decline is going to set them up for killing as well. It's called euthanasia at that point, or assisted suicide, which we can push you towards. If we make your life miserable enough, you'll want to die. We'll help you. So that idea of self-awareness and agency, that is the self-conscious capacity to anticipate the future or to make choices, take action based on that awareness, Singer justifies infanticide in print. And he got protests for it, but he defended it very robustly. He is an evolutionary psychologist, effectively, writing the ethics of this. Whereas there is a counter movement, and it's particularly represented by a man named Christian Smith, which I think is really interesting. He writes a book called Moral Believing Animals, Human Personhood and Culture. And he argues that the fundamental motivation for human action is to act out and sustain moral order. So moral order is seen not as something that is subjective, but objective. And that objective moral order helps constitute, direct, and makes significant human life itself. So the assumption of the Tao, in other words, which is that moral order, is the very thing that constitutes, directs, and gives meaning to human life. If we don't have a sense of a moral order. That's Lewis's argument in The Abolition of Man. Christian Smith is clearly saying something. And so human persons nearly universally live in social worlds, says Smith, which are thickly webbed with moral assumptions, beliefs, commitments, and obligations. Our world, by the way, in modernity, we have been trying to break down the web of moral assumptions, beliefs, commitments, and obligations for centuries. And all of these are assaults on human personhood. Because the human person has a moral nature. And the moral nature leads to a family order and a social order and a political order. Moral, by the way, is not another way of saying personal preferences. He's also at pains to say it's not about what I like, it's about what is, because of what is, what ought to be, and what has to be. So this is very interesting. And it's interesting to see some contemporary scholars and pushing back on what it means to be a person. And I think Lewis is particularly interested in that. I'm going to show that in the study of the Silent Planet. Let me say a few more things about that then. And maybe I can begin the story. Comments or questions? Yes?
What did you call Smith's position?
What did he call it? He called it, what's his book called? Moral, believing animals, human personhood and culture. Now, he's a sociologist engaging within his discipline and arguing that morality is not just a thread, but a necessary foundation for all the other thing that sociology talks about. But he's pushing against modern sociology and the whole dominant position of sociology that what we call morality is a social construct. And the social construct could change not just a little bit, but radically. And in fact, the change in sociological conceptions will change in the direction of progress. And what does progress mean? It means moving towards the null that I said right at the outset is the subject of this study. Void, the strange physics of nothing. The view from nowhere, which is so much a part of its hermeneutics, which I described. And as I say, it's the ideal already in romantic poetry, where they repeatedly refer to silence and absence and vacancy as the ideal form of human conception is to fail to be able to conceptualize. Imaginative failure. It's represented in romantic poetry in the early 19th century. It stays there. Never goes away. John Cage comes up with a type of musical performance in which he doesn't make a noise. I don't know if you know anything about John Cage, but you sit there and you can hear all the noises in the room as people shuffle sort of embarrassedly, awkwardly. Here's the performance and I'm hearing nothing. Modern painting has blank canvases. Yeah. Why 4 minutes, 30 seconds? Who knows? But that's it. But it's a vacant, but an odd thing. What a performance. A performer. Same with Thomas A. Becket. Waiting for Godot. there's a sort of a vacancy and emptiness, which is the ideal of modern art. And it's not accidental. It's a pure reflection of the same tendency that Lewis is at odds with and is very much seeking to repudiate intellectually and as an artist. Yes.
So after reading First Man in the Moon, I was quite disturbed.
You told me, yes.
I did. I guess after thinking about it some more, what I was like, because Frankenstein, there's this sense of immediate of what have I done? Like there's this like cautionary tale, even though it's not necessarily from a Christian perspective. Um, what would H.G. Wells think is attractive of what he's presented when there's all the three different? He doesn't give an alternative where anything matters, any person matters. What does he find attractive about his view and his belief?
I think he thinks that's a great question. So why does he present it if he has nothing appealing to live in and to present others as an ideal? So he's, as we said, science fiction in its nature is always a critique, a social critique of chiefly science and what it seeks to do. I think that's the main object of social critique, is the consequence of that view of science on humanity. And so what does he put forward? He's got nothing. There's nothing. I would say the same is true of Aldous Huxley. And the same is true of H.G. Wells, but also of George Orwell. So the so-called profound critics of totalitarianism, fascism, Nazism, communism, whatever, but forms of government in which humanity matters about as much as a fly, probably less, but the image given in 1984 is, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. That's the ideal of the party. That's a bleak picture. There's no alternative to this. They see this as the character of modern science. So insofar as they correctly diagnose that, they have something to say, I guess, but they have no alternative. And they propose nothing positive. They have nothing to propose. To do that, they have to dig into a theological point of view that they have I don't know why they've rejected it, quite frankly, what the motivation for is, but they do not consider it. And again, those books are pushed in the schools. They're taught as literature. I engage with it myself in first year. I do Huxley and I do Orwell now. But I say in that, they have no solution to the problem they more or less accurately diagnose. Mary Shelley does actually have a solution, which is interesting. Her solution is love, interestingly. But love is basically sentiment. It's the feeling that we have towards other people. It's relational. It's feeling. It's attending to feeling as opposed to reason. And reason is portrayed as the bad guy. And the scientist Victor Frankenstein, he's as you say, it's cautionary tale. Don't listen to the scientists, but it is listen to the poets. And the poets are more feminine. It is again portrayed as this dichotomy. You get the evil masculine scientist and you get the victim that's female. And the Frankenstein monster himself is feminine in the sense that he's passive. The subject of the scientist's scalpel, his body is violated, as it were, and he even creates a creature for Frankenstein, and he kills it before it even comes to life. But Frankenstein himself calls himself, the creature calls himself an abortion. It's really interesting language. More than once speaks of himself as an abortion in the way that he was treated with hatred by his creator. And it was juxtaposed with Milton. So you could think at that point, they could actually gravitate towards Milton's view. But that's not how Shelley wants us to read Paradise Lost. He does read it as a true myth, I think, but it's still a myth. And it's not a true myth in the sense that Lewis reads the account of the fall. It's more from the progressive viewpoint, it's about the power of the imagination of the poet. So rather than reason, it's the imagination that will save us. The human imagination, such as that of her husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, who writes so much about the imagination in his works. I deal with that in my course on Romanticism. But yes, then there's nothing there. So you would have thought, if that's the case, then there might be a great outcry desiring something other than this. But it's not there in the school system, the public school system. And as I say, the prophetic voices are to be found in the wilderness, like they always are. But they're not unpopular voices. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, the most popular fictional work of the 20th century. And Lewis's are among them, not just amongst Christians. And as I said, the thing that always struck me, and it was, for me, it was also of apologetics significance, is that when the academy goes populist and doesn't care about the traditional humanities, but just wants to deal with contemporary culture, then you would have thought it would be of academic interest, this phenomena that so many people are interested in Tolkien and Lewis's work. Why would you not study that in the university? And I found that they don't even read the works. And I'd say, well, but that is totally contradicts the way you normally do things. Why are you not willing to read such popular authors? And my only conclusion is they don't want their works to be read. And yet they can't prevent them from being read. So instead, they'll just attack them, do the ad hominem. They'll attack the characters, the persons. As imaginative, or they call it fantasy in the case of Lewis, or in the case of fiction. Tolkien. Try to speak. Masson. They'll dismiss it as fantastical and imaginative, but of no relevance. But anybody who reads it knows the opposite. It is social criticism, and it seems to have a dimension to it that is addressing the very deficits of atheistic science fiction. And it does do that. Whether it leads you to be a Christian or not, that's another feature, but there's something profoundly enriching about the fiction of both men that has been widely recognized. I shared your horror when I first realized this. And I realized it as an undergraduate before I was a Christian as well, which is interesting. My own path in this, not that it's interesting in and of itself, but I recognized the critique of the atheists, like Wells, who I read as a small, like I was 9, 10 as well, and then moved on to Huxley and Orwell in grade 12 and was fascinated by this. That there's an accuracy to what they're saying, but there's nothing there. This is bleak. What is there that would give me a meaning and a purpose to my life and will say something about the significance of human nature? Where do I find that? I find it in the old stories, the old hero stories. There's a meaning to life, and you can fight for it, and there are knights battling dragons, and that's Lewis and Tolkien. But again, and I didn't read Lewis and Tolkien until I was 30. They're fiction. When I came upon it, I thought, oh, how is it that I never got exposed to this before? Rather than digging into the novel. Next time I'm going to go through the novel in one take. But the purpose of this, again, is not just you can read the story. I don't think it's difficult. It's more to see what Lewis is doing with the novel and to see, I think it's a compelling read. I think it's a good read. I think it's better than H.G. Wells actually as a story. And in part because that Wells' story is very bleak. It's a canvas in black and white, and Lewis puts a lot of color in it and vitality. And I recognize what he's doing there, again, by having read the first one. Okay, Lewis is responding to the idea of outer space, the idea of human life, the idea that the really hostile thing is actually what H.G. Wells himself acknowledges. Humanity is the threat. because they kill each other all the time. They seem to place no value on it. They want to conquer. In fact, these earthlings have come up to the moon, and their aim is to get gold and populate the world with other forms of life, but to kill everything else to get there. Well, then who's the god of war? It's man. That's the god of war. We worship the god of war, or the goddess of love, but not the goddess of love as he comes down in the form of Christ, but rather that expression of human desires, lasciviousness, etc. So that's the main thing. That's the best, I think, from a university lecture point of view, rather than just say, the novel's about this, here are the characters, here's the plot line. You can read that on Wikipedia, and it's more or less accurate. It just will not help you much aside from that in terms of commentary, which is not a criticism, it's just an observation. I mean, maybe it is a criticism, but I don't think it's Wikipedia articles are supposed to give you a great deal of commentary of any profundity. And this is interesting as well. It's actually what Ransom sees and learns from his encounters with the Malacandrians that is the subject of main interest. It's his learning, just like in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It's what Walton learns from hearing these stories that is the takeaway. And Walton in Frankenstein and Ransom in Out of the Silent Planet represents the reader. We're supposed to learn from this, so it has a didactic purpose, and that's embedded in the vantage point here. We see the development of Edwin Ransom, the character, his mindset changes. Weston and Devine are static characters who don't change. At least not in this novel. When we meet Weston in the next novel, we'll find that he has gone from being a materialist to being a pure spiritualist, which is what he thinks Ransom's position is. Because again, he doesn't understand that Ransom's position as a Christian will hold on to both positions. He sees it as spiritual, because again, that's how the scientists view the humanities. It's just a spiritual thing. So anyway, that's it for today. I think I'll see you next class, and we'll run through the whole